Hi, everyone. I'm the director for our New Zealand registered not-for-profit Common Knowledge Trust, and we hold all of the skills that mothers and fathers developed, hundreds of them, in the early 1970s, and it's now called Birthing Better. It used to be called the Pink Kit, so they're now online birthing classes. And what I want to do today is I want to talk to you about us as women experiencing birth trauma and holding that birth trauma for years. As you can read in the description, that wasn't something that really happened for my generation, but because I lived through it, I actually understand how we got here. And I want to talk to all of you who feel birth trauma, and I want you to share this with people because I'm going to be very blunt and very direct with you because even in the early 1970s, I could see this coming because I gave birth in 1970. So I understood the message that was being given to me. And my last birth was in 1982, and the childbirth trend in the United States had changed. And so I understood that message as well. And I've followed childbirth for 50 years. I speak only as the director of Common Knowledge Trust. Personally, birth is not my political agenda. It never has been. I was privileged to work with hundreds of mothers and fathers just as a body worker, and we developed birthing better skills based on our human body. We all blink, we all cough, we can all tighten up our rectum. And there are other realities attached to that. We're either pregnant as women or we're not pregnant as women. And if we are pregnant, 100% of us around the world throughout time have to give birth. That's just the reality. And giving birth, and it's such a weak verb, giving birth. Sewing's cooking, is digging a hole. That's a strong verb, but giving birth is a very weak birth. The only inclination is the word labor, meaning hard work. And back in 1970, when I gave birth, 95% of us labored because cesareans were really major abdominal surgery used to save a woman's life. But back then in 1970, when the very first childbirth preparation classes were being taught, they were all skills-based. Lamaze was taught in every hospital in the United States, and Bradley was sort of more upmarket, and that was called husband coach childbirth. So from the 60s to the mid-70s, multiple millions, and this is what you got to get your head wrapped around, millions of us, pregnant women and fathers who we demanded were at birth with us, we learned skills. And we used those skills. They were often inefficient skills alongside all of the medical assessments, the monitoring and procedures that were done to us in this new modern maternity care system. And back then, it became apparent that there was going to be this sort of division in childbirth, but it was small and it grew. So it didn't really impact my generation. We just used skills. And the message behind the skills sort of went over our head because the skills were taught to everybody. But Lamaze Bradley in New Zealand, where I live, Grantley Dick Reed, and he's Childbirth Without Fear, were obstetricians who thought that the medical profession was consuming all maternity care. And they're accurate about that. And so what they did was actually to divide low-risk women and say to low-risk women, if you use our skills, breathing and relaxation skills, you can achieve a natural birth. And that became one of the problems that has led to your trauma today, is that the word natural or normal or physiological has been, those words have changed their true meaning, and those true meanings still exist. So the change of those words has caused you to think a certain way. So those three words, normal, natural, and physiological, when it comes to pregnancy and birth globally throughout time, is that anything that can happen might happen. And my generation of women in modern maternity care, that was a perfect example. There was a 4.5% cesarean rate. Risks were considered to be normal, natural, and physiological. And they didn't have the diagnostic tools they have today. And they didn't have the push by modern women to avoid risks. So we all labored, whether we had a good time or whether we suffered, whether we labored for hours or days, whether we had a good outcome or a tragedy. So those things were all considered to be normal, natural, and physiological. But the message was beginning to bleed through the societal conscience that there were low risk women and high risk women. And that was one of the primary mistakes that has caused you to have birth trauma today. Because 100% of pregnant women are going to do this activity of birthing their baby. And if Lamaze, Bradley, and Grantley Dick Reed had had foresight, they would have said 100% of pregnant women, it should be natural and normal to learn self-learn birth skills in pregnancy, and then use those skills while you work through the activity of birthing your baby. Didn't matter where, doesn't matter who's present, doesn't matter your circumstances, doesn't matter your beliefs, it doesn't matter your choices or lack of choices or change of choices or what happens at the birth. All of us get pregnant to have a baby. 100% of us get pregnant to have a baby. We don't get pregnant to have a type of birth. And there is actually no correlation between how women cope with natural occurring labor pain, whether they're low or high risk, or whether low or high risk women end up with a problem or a problem that becomes a tragedy. So you are experiencing birth trauma today because that initial message separated low risk from high risk, with the belief that if you learned these simple skills, that you could have a natural birth, a pain-free labor, and you could do that without medical care. However, you need to understand that even back in the 70s, modern medical care has guidelines to practice, standards of care, and evidence-based care. That's true of all healthcare. It's just specific for maternity care. Those guidelines to practice, those evidence-based practice, those standards of care have changed. Even when I gave birth in 1970 and my last birth in 1980. So I was shaved, I was given an enema, I had to lie on my back, everybody was given an episiotomy, everybody's baby was delivered by forceps, and there were other ones, just lots. We didn't breastfeed, we couldn't eat, we couldn't drink, we couldn't get out of bed. So those standards of care changed, and a large part they changed because multiple millions of my generation use skills, inefficient skills often, but they worked for many women, and we use those skills alongside all those standards of care. And this is what's important for you who experience birth trauma today, is that you are not living in a skills-based approach to childbirth. There's no societal message out there. It's all about your choices. We didn't have choices. So we used skills and we worked alongside those gnarly standards of care that we experienced. And the multiple millions of my generation of women and men felt empowered by their births, even if there were risks, even if there were tragedies. Less of us suffered. The suffering, the inability to cope, the inability to manage, the inability to work through or to deal with or to handle or to stay on top of or to feel in control, we got in control because we used skills. So part of the birth trauma that so many of you experience today is just feeling out of control, and then putting a large amount of emphasis on those people around you. So back then, the reason that you have birth trauma today is that those three obstetricians didn't have the foresight to say 100% of pregnant women, it should be normal and natural to become skilled to birth your baby, no matter what. So because they didn't give that message, my children's generation weren't given that message, and their children's generation, which is you, were not given that message. So in my generation, shame, blame, guilt, disappointment, frustration, anger, birth trauma really, really, really did not exist very much. Even those of us who experienced tragedies, we were traumatized by the tragedy, and we had to heal from it. And some of us did carry it onward, but most of us, if we had used skills, we felt more empowered by the use of our skills as these tragedies were unfolding. I can't stress that enough. It's like If you're driving a car and you stop paying attention and something happens and you realize that happened because I didn't use skills. And if you did use skills, you can feel traumatized, but you know you did your best. So when I'm talking to you now as women who've experienced birth trauma, I need to tell you it's not your fault. It's not your fault because the societal messages given to you have set you up for this. And it's hard for you to understand what 50 years of my being involved in the childbirth conversation means because I've been involved with it globally. And the message that the hundreds of mothers and fathers, the concept that it's normal and natural when you're pregnant to self-learn birth skills and use skills to do the activity of birthing your baby was shouted down by the next generation of people who followed Lamaze, Bradley, and Grantley Dick Reed, which were the famous natural childbirth movement, famous authors and the messages that were given. In fact, all of childbirth preparation changed from the 70s to the 80s. It changed from skills to barely any skills and focusing on choice. And the choice wasn't to have women choose more medical care. It was specifically for women to say no to medical care because those assessments, those monitoring, those procedures that I and multiple millions of women had experienced when we gave birth in the 60s to the mid-70s were now being called interventions. And those interventions, the implication of them was that they were imposed on us and unnecessary. And here's a list of those interventions. So what we as women began to say to one another, and another reason why you are so traumatized by your birth is that you listened, as we all do, to what we as women say to each other. And the message by the mid-1970s was very clear. We should avoid all of these interventions in order to achieve this natural birth in which the word natural, normal, and physiological, even today, instead of meaning anything that could happen, might happen, good, bad, ugly, suffering, fine, tragedy, great, wonderful, anything that might happen could happen. Instead of that, the natural birth movement has taken that to mean that a natural birth is an easy birth with a good outcome, that's really a low-risk birth, that's spontaneous, where women cope well. They can even have this orgasmic birth, and they do it preferably at home, being left alone, and they discover birth themselves, and they can have this orgasmic birth, and that everybody is wonderful. And I can only tell you from having listened to tens and thousands of birth stories globally, that is as rare as hen's teeth. Yet your birth trauma is as common as spaghetti and meatballs. And this is what is so shockingly sad today, that we as women have given each other the message that there is some type of ideal birth, whereas the hundreds of fathers and mothers who developed the birthing better skills, we knew these facts. We get pregnant to have a baby. Our baby's birth is important to us. It is an activity that we, the pregnant woman, is the only one doing with our baby. Nobody else can do it for us. We can't stop for lunch. And if we are doing this infrequent activity, this one-off activity, this life-transforming activity, this dynamic activity that can last 4 hours, if we as women are not elevating this activity to being highly skilled, then many of us just experience the suffering, and therefore we call it the birth trauma, that women preceding my generation experienced from the beginning of time. They suffered, and they were left traumatized by their birth. But traditional women, where there's no medical care, don't have any expectations about trauma. Life's hard. They have to get water, they have to make their own food, their own clothes, their own tools, their own housing. So it's hard work, it's labor. But modern women don't do that labor. Our lives are easier. That's what we want. And so we expect birth to be this highlight experience. That's what women have told each other it is. And the natural birth movement has never been honest about what birth is. And they've always tried to say, well, it's not pain during a contraction, it's a rush. No, it's pain, right? And if we gave birth as frequently as we had sex, which is another normal, natural, physiological urge, or as frequently as we got hungry, as women, we would want that activity to be highly skilled. But because it's infrequent, we've had this ability to say, there's no way to know what your birth's going to be like, which is true, and therefore there's nothing you can really do to prepare for it, and that's inaccurate. So for all of you that are traumatized, you need to understand it's not your fault. You did not get the message that my generation was given, which is at least use some skills, because we felt more in control. We didn't suffer. Did we like all the fiddle that was done to us? Yeah. Would we have gone bush in 1970? No. We were modern people. Penicillin has just been recently developed. Rogam for Rh negative had not been developed. So you need to understand that modern people were trying to reduce or prevent the risks from becoming tragedies, and we want to reduce the suffering. And as clumsy and as awkward as the modern maternity system has always been, it has done that because modern people have demanded it to be. So you need to understand that part of your trauma has been the fact that birth skills were removed from the childbirth conversation. And your stress since 1980s has been to make a birth plan and to tell people what you want. The message was, you know what you want, that women know what they want at their birth, and that they should make choices, make a birth plan, and birth professionals should give them the birth they want or include them in decision making. And both of those are complex because there's no way to know what your birth's going to be like. And in the tens of thousands of birth stories I've heard, probably less than that many have had the birth they thought they were going to have. Most of us have a birth that's unlike anything that we planned. Babies don't come to plan. Yet if women are telling each other, make a birth plan and have an expectation that they provide us with this birth, then many of us are going to be left with birth trauma. And you're the product of that. It's the disappointment that you didn't get the birth you wanted. And it's the disappointment that you ended up with any of these interventions. I spoke to a woman who is the mother of the Ministry of Health in New Zealand. She's a woman my age who said to me, because she gave birth in the 1980s in New Zealand, that she wanted a natural birth. And then she said, but I was induced. And that is so sad. This is a human being, a woman, who is carrying an emotional trauma about something she felt she failed to achieve. Do you understand this? You have to do the activity of birthing your baby, whether you're induced or not, or whether you have any of those interventions, whether you like them or not, whether you hate everything, whether you have pain or no pain. If your pain makes you feel like you're going to die, imagine yourself as human beings with basically two choices: no skills or skilled. No skilled people may or may not find skills during the length of time it takes to birth your baby. It's not as likely, is it, than if you have skills, even imperfect ones, but you apply them, you drill down, you toughen up, you do the task at hand. Which person, which woman is more likely to feel traumatized? what the woman without skills is. The woman with skills may hate every second, may hate what they do to or around her. That's okay. If you're a parent, right, there are days you hate your children. There are days you hate being a parent. However, society expects you to use skills to parent appropriately. That's why we have conversations about abused children with people who lack skills. We lack skills in birth. We cannot respond to the task at hand. We can't do the task at hand. We're left feeling helpless and useless. And that's why we're left traumatized. If we didn't have birth plans drumming at us, we wouldn't be as traumatized because we wouldn't have such high expectations. But we have very high expectations around birth because we've been told this by women in the natural birth movement. When you go online to YouTube or into Facebook, you very rarely hear the stories of the masses of women because we're too embarrassed to talk about how challenging birth was. If you go to the breech Facebook pages, the VBAC pages, you most often hear about people who've had success. And people who haven't often are apologetic. And many, many women in the past 50 years have been left with the birth trauma that you have. Now, you can say to me, but they did this to me. They did that to you. Yes, they did. They did. And you are left feeling traumatized. And this is where mothers and fathers helped me understand relativity. To be traumatized, as the mother of the Minister of Health said, I was induced. That's trauma. She felt traumatized by that. Compare that to if her child had died. Do you think that's a fair comparison? Our mind does not differentiate trauma from trauma. We differentiate it by choice. We choose to be traumatized by things that happen to us that we don't like. Many of us experience lots of opportunities to feel traumatized in life, and we flick them right off. But we've been told that if we don't achieve a particular type of birth, or if our birth doesn't come to plan because of something they do or something they didn't do, or some failure that we had, because we weren't told that this is an activity that we have to do and that it's normal and natural self-learned skills to do it, as imperfectly as we might do it, at least we felt empowered by having the capacity to keep using skills. Well, everything fell apart. And it's very similar to the natural birth movements as women saying to each other, women need to feel safe to give birth. When you hear that, does that make sense to women in Syria or during the Afghan wars? Does that make sense to women who experience abuse or substance abuse? Does birth stop because you're terrified of birth? No? And go to the second one in this series where I talk about the gift of fear. Because as women, we've told each other, if you're afraid of birth, you're a failure. No wonder you feel traumatized. We're told that if we don't fear birth, that this hormone oxytocin is going to rise up in us. And it's the love hormone. We don't feel that. We feel pain of contractions. It's normal, natural, and physiological. And that pain can be very, very, very intense to the point that we feel we're going to die. That physiological hormone is rising up because that's a natural byproduct of pregnancy and birth. But it doesn't elevate to the part of our body that tells us to go, love this pain. So women to each other we have just been crazy about this normal and natural physiological activity that all pregnant women have to do. And you've been left traumatized. So let me tell you that there are 3 and should be 4 elements to most birth stories. All of them, one of them, or some of them together, or all of them can cause the birth trauma you have now. And we want to help you to heal from that by first having you recognize it's not your fault, right? And second of all, to give you the skills to have comparativeness. If what happened to you was the worst thing in the world, imagine what could be worse. And then begin to heal. Because we have traumas all of our lives. Do you think that I have lived my life to my age without having traumas in it? I've had to deal with those things as you have. I've had to make choices. I've had to figure out how not to carry bitterness and anger and frustration and disappointment. Just as you do. Just as all of us do. But we have placed so much emphasis on a particular type of birth. And I'm going to show you exactly what that is. Because this is the ideal birth, as expressed to me, teaching classes to the wonderful, wonderful New Zealand midwives who give so much in their midwifery model of care, except they have not, since 1990, considered it to be normal, natural, to self-learn birth skills for their clients and then use those skills as they work through the activity of giving birth. They are dogmatically opposed to women having skills because they consider that it insults our instinct and that everything is about choices. So they've set up a partnership model in which they don't, first of all, they don't explain it to their clients. And second of all, if they do, they explain it this way. We respect your choices. What do you want and don't want in your birth? And what do you expect of me? To which, since 1990, women in New Zealand have exhausted the women who work as midwives. And this cannot sustain itself. This concept of an ideal birth is why you are traumatized today. Did I have ideal births? Are you kidding me? Am I left traumatized by my births? No. Why? I used Lamaze in my first birth. Didn't always work and was told very clearly by my birth, the woman who taught the classes, they don't work when you're induced. They don't work when you have pain. They don't work. And I thought to myself, how can you have a set of skills that don't work for 100% of pregnant women and 100% of births? That makes no sense. That's like teaching people to drive a car and then only 10% or 15% of the skills work where you're driving, right? I mean, that doesn't make sense. We can't replay birth. It's not like cooking and making mistakes and having a poor meal and doing it again later that day, or even with sex. Birth is a one-off. It can't be replayed. It's infrequent. And it lasts for a long time. And when you're in trauma over a period of time, you hold on to that trauma. And what happens when you hold on to that trauma is that you depreciate yourself. You have difficulty in parenting your children. They don't know what's the matter. And your whole family's impacted by it. What does that serve? What does that serve? It doesn't serve our societies. It doesn't serve your children. It doesn't serve you. It doesn't serve your partner. And it doesn't serve the childbirth conversation. So the 4 elements in birth, and only 3 of them are talked about now, is temporal. When things started, I started to drive to the hospital at 10 in the morning. I had my cesarean at 1 p.m. Or my labor started at 3 in the morning. My water bag broke at 6. I went to the hospital. The midwife came. I gave birth at da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Are some people traumatized by that part of the conversation? Oh, absolutely, they're traumatized. I had a 72-hour labor. Well, no, you didn't. Because labor really is when you start to dilate. And if you didn't dilate and you ended up with a cesarean, this is what's important to know. It was an activity you did with your baby, no matter what. And if you had skills, and if you had been told since the 1970s to use skills to do the activity of birthing your baby, you would have used those skills in those 72 hours. And if that birth ended up with a surgical birth, you would have continued to use your skills through being prepped and in surgery, because you had been imprinted into your mind that this is an infrequent one-off activity and you should use skills to do this activity, birth your baby, because that's what will empower you, skillfully doing something that you may hate and not like. So even people who tell that temporal part, that temporal element of birth stories, can feel traumatized, but that's not as frequent. The second element is what they did or didn't do, and that's where a huge amount of the birth trauma you experience today comes from. I was given a rough internal. I wasn't told. My husband was an asshole. When you give birth, you cannot control the external situations. Go back to the women in Syria or Afghanistan, or the women in the United States during the hurricanes. We cannot control this, or the women giving birth in COVID. We can't control this. You are not in control. The only thing you can control is your ability to respond. That's the only thing any of us can do any time in life. And when we have skills, we use those skills. If your child choked, if you knew the Heimlich maneuver, you would be scared out of your pants and you would apply the skills as best as you could, the same way as your mother or father had a heart attack in your presence, or your husband fell off the roof. When you have skills, you do better. We birth better with skills. And we still have trauma, but we balance that with our capacity. So what they didn't do to us has been exacerbated by birth plans, blown up. When birth plans first came out, women used to write a book, every little detail. Even the birth plans today that are streamlined make no sense. If you go to the hospital, they have standards of care, guidelines to practice, evidence-based practice. They are going to do those assessments, monitoring, and procedures, and you may not like how they are done. You can fiddle with the corners, but really you've got to do that activity. So do that activity with skills, because if you look overwhelmed, they don't want you to suffer. And if you don't get on with your birth, they don't want you or your baby to potentially become a risk. So they're more likely to do more assessments, monitoring, procedures. And if that goes against your birth plans, what they did or didn't do to you in the second element of childbirth that women tell, then you get left with the birth trauma you have today. And you don't know how to unwind it because you want them to replay it, and they won't replay it, and they're not even thinking about you. You have to choose to let go of this trauma. And how do you choose to let go of it? Just like easiest is let go of it. Stop yourself. Because it harms yourself, it harms your baby, and it harms your partner. But it's not so easy to say no to trauma because it's imprinted in us in the most basic form of our brain and our body. So we have to go through a process of letting go of it. And one is the third element of the childbirth stories that I hear, which is what women feel and don't feel. I had terrible back labor. I tried using the skills, but they didn't work. I pushed for hours. My birth was so quick, I thought I was going to die. My baby didn't engage, and I wanted a home birth, and I ended up having a cesarean. So it's all about ourselves. And so these two elements, what they did and didn't do, and our own sense of failure, our own sense of inability to cope and manage or sort out our own activity, that what we are doing is the major driver for the birth trauma you feel today. When we had skills, because I've been fortunate for 50 years to work only with skilled families that use birthing better. And our trust doesn't care if you use birthing better. We know why this is an evolution of skills, because it was, first of all, it's developed by hundreds of mothers and fathers, and it was for all births, so it's adaptable to your experience. But we don't care. We just want everybody to become skilled. And we want every birth professional to tell all their clients, you're doing this activity, and hopefully hand them a piece of paper with different skills-based methods. Tell them to gather information, make a birth plan. Be great if their choices unfold the way they want. But they have to do the activity. You had to do that activity. And you're either pissed off at them or pissed off at yourself or both. So the question is how do you heal from this? And this is one of the skills that Birthing Better fathers and mothers, particularly mothers, help develop, and that's the negative voice over the positive voice. And any of you who are parents know this, because when we hate our kids and we hate what they're doing and we hate being a parent and we hate being a partner and we hate our work and we hate anything else, honor it. It's what we feel. And then choose to behave with dignity and pride, self-containment. That's what an adult does. That's what a mother and a father does. That's what an adult does, and that's what a child does not do. So honor the negative and apply the positive. That's one skill. Another skill is forgiveness. The medical profession is what it is. You have no idea who that woman or man was, or those women and men who were with you, who could be your mother, your father, your aunt, your uncles, your grandparents, your brothers, your sisters, your kids. You don't know whether they've just lost a relative to COVID. You don't know whether they've been at 10 births before they got to yours. We have an expectation that everything centers around us when we're pregnant and giving birth. No, it only centers around us because we are the only one doing that activity. And therefore, we need to be highly skilled to do it. And when we're not skilled and we expect them to treat us the way we want as some sort of a privileged person because we're pregnant and giving birth, it's both unrealistic and it doesn't take into consideration the human beings who are working in the hospital or coming to your home. So one is forgive them. The third skill is just forgive yourself. You are the byproduct of a natural birth movement that dismissed skills. In a simple sentence, cows and cats aren't taught to birth. Women don't need to be taught to birth. And my 50 years of having people scream at me that I am diminishing the capacity of women to birth rather than elevating our humanity to see this activity as something that we should be highly skilled for. It's like an Olympic event. Oh, come on. I mean, let's take swimming. You know, some of us don't swim, you know, but basically if you just sort of dump somebody in water, they either will drown, but that urge to live will teach people very quickly to swim. Not perfectly. But if they have to swim for 3 hours, 10 hours, 20 hours, or that 72 hours I talked about, boy, you needed to adapt and adjust those skills. But you had to keep doing it because, you know, the other is that you would drown literally or metaphorically. And women drown in childbirth. They drown from the sensations they have and their inability to control it. So wouldn't we like to have some skills? Wouldn't we like to know when to float, how to float to relax, and how to swim to relax? Of course we would. Birth is a big, big life-transforming activity, and we as women have been telling each other, it's a nothing burger. It's normal, meaning it's easy. It's natural. Good outcome. It's physiological. You can't do anything about it. So just aim for this ideal birth. And if you don't have that, then what? Then you feel that third element. You feel disappointed and angry. And if they did anything to you, you're pissed off at them. And those two combined is what has just blown out of the water the shame, blame, guilt, disappointment, anger, frustration that so many women of your generation have had. And since COVID, I've decided to come back out and talk about this because we can't do this. Everybody needs to be giving this message. It is normal and natural when you're pregnant to self-learn some birth skills and birth coaching skills and use those birth and birth coaching skills to do the activity of birthing your baby, no matter what happens to or around you. For goodness sakes, this is a massive activity. We need to elevate it to becoming skilled. Give that message. Take those actions. And what's the fourth element that I talked about that my generation experienced, which was women who tell stories about the skills they've used. Now, you can see on YouTube some beautiful birth pictures and videos of women just so contained. The natural birth movement would say, oh, that woman's just instinctively birthing. No, she's not. I've asked thousands of them, right? Because some women birth like that, and I've been at births like that. And you know what women tell me? I really focused on my breathing. I really focused on relaxing. And do you know what many women tell me after their first not so good birth? Next time, I will not get into the birth as easily. If I have pre-stuff, that 72-hour labor stuff, I'm just going to go about my business now and wait till the labor really gets progressive. That's a skill. That's asking yourself the question, what do I want to do now? And then doing it, rather than trying to get your labor going and getting exhausted from that. And what else do they tell me that they've learned from their first unskilled birth, or maybe not using their skills as effectively? I'll use my breathing skills more effectively. I will relax more effectively. Humans thrive on being skilled. Your birth trauma comes primarily from just your lack of skills or lack of adjusting or adapting the ones you had or giving up on using them. So how do you re-heal along with some of these skills we've just given you? Another skill is go back and replay that birth being skilled. Go back and replay that birth using breathing and relaxation and not changing the outcome and not changing what they do and don't do to you. Go back and replay it with part of your mind going, fuck, hate it, hate them, can't stand what they're doing. But I am going to use my skills and this is going to be a dignified experience for me. Go back and replay that birth. That's another skill mothers and fathers taught me to do and told me to pass on to you. Make a ceremony where you have a circle on the ground and you put all the bad things about your birth and go around and talk to each of those points. And when you're finished, when you're empty, when you have said it all, then create a pathway to another circle of what it is when you are healed. And then live in that circle. And when this comes back, say, I've completed you. and slowly begin to reduce that, because our mind can't differentiate between real and imagined. When we go to a movie, we know it's not real, but we respond as though it's real. So when bad thoughts about our birth come up again, we can just sit there and say to our mind, sit down and shut up. It's hard work because we have to replace that negative thought with a positive thought. The same way when we garden, you cannot take a weed out and leave it there because nature abhors a vacuum and it will just come back again. You need to plant what you want there. That means you have to plant good ideas, and you have to not try to wipe out the trauma. You have to grow from it, mature from it, because that's what adults do. And that's what we try to teach our children, is how to accept trauma, not like it, who does, and to find ways to move forward. Are there other ways to deal with your trauma? Absolutely. Change your attitude. Look at your child. You feeling traumatized about this child's birth doesn't serve this child. And this is what women are doing to each other. When I gave birth, if we had a tragedy, there was a tragedy, right? But we just accepted birth, really, by and large. Fortunately, we had those skills from the 60s and mid-70s. But now we have this ideal birth. And so what do women say to each other now, and have been saying to each other for the past 40 years? I had a home birth. You had a cesarean. Or women, I had a cesarean. I didn't get the birth I wanted. But what do we say about our children? She was my cesarean. He was my home birth. This isn't okay. It's not okay. We need to give a new childbirth message. In pregnancy, it is normal and natural to self-learn birth skills and birth coaching skills, and to have fathers or others really know how to help you cope and manage. And then use those skills to work through the activity of birthing your baby. Because that fourth element, that element is the one in which my generation recalls our birth with dignity and pride. Did I like being shaved and have an enema? Did I like having a double episiotomy? Nah. Did I think that everybody in the hospital was great? Nah. However, when I gave birth in the 70s last, I gave birth to an 8-week premature baby, but I had these skills. And do you know what? A strange hospital in a strange town with people I'd never met watched a strange woman use skills while they did assessments and monitoring procedures to safeguard the health and well-being of my 8-week premature baby. And because of my behavior, and because I worked alongside with whatever they needed to do, I got on with my birth. They just let me deliver him myself. They stood around and clapped. How do you think they remember that birth? So how do you change the birth trauma that you have? Use the skills that I've mentioned. Use others. You got pregnant to have this child. Your child deserves a fully present mother. You can let go of that trauma. You need to. Now, how can you help support our efforts as a trust? Donate, subscribe to our YouTube channel, watch this series, Pass this on, share it on Facebook, get in touch with us in the inbox and Facebook. Tell your birth professional that you're going to learn some skills and then have them mark in your notes from 24 weeks onward every skill you've learned, and have them praise you if you look like you're using skills and your partner looks like you're using skills, and tell them to encourage you if you're looking overwhelmed. Use your skills and pass on the concept. It's normal and natural in pregnancy to self-learn birth and birth coaching skills, and then use them to work through the activity of birthing your baby. Let's change childbirth. Let's start to reduce the trauma. I can't do it alone. Only you can do it. We have to viral this concept. If you know how, help our trust. And I'm going to do one on fathers being traumatized. Because men are human beings. And everybody wants to have a continuity of self as an adult. And they don't want to lose that continuity of self through pregnancy and through birth. Because it's much harder to have continuity of self to parent when you are still trying to deal with the past. Thank you very much for listening to this.